You don't want to be known as soft. You don't want to be known as small. You don't want to be known as easy to push around. This is a tough game. And there's a lot of tough guys. And these guys are warriors out on the ice.
Welcome to Between the Hashmarks from the Business of Hockey and the Goal podcast with Richard York and Les Kowalski. Let's start this episode. The main reason why we're doing this is that what we found is there's really nothing really out there, is there, Richard, about talking about the business side or the management of hockey or even talking about the ownership groups or anything like that.
Yeah, when you get into the media and everything, the players and the scores and stuff like that definitely take all the headlines. But with any kind of business, it tends to trail from the top down. That if you have imperfections at the top, you have imperfections down on the ice. So it's interesting to see how the business and how the management dictates how they run their company to help create this winning environment that hockey players seem to do well in. And like a lot of them talk about the culture and the definition of what the culture of a hockey club is, but they never tell you what that culture is because it's not on the ice, it's off the ice. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about what the definition of culture is for a hockey franchise.
The timing of this Business of Hockey and the Goal series, we're basically dividing it into two parts. We have Between the Hashmarks, which is focusing on the hockey of management side. And then we've got a new episode, which is called the Syndicate, which is going to be focusing a lot more on the ownership side. And so in this inaugural podcast episode, the original focus was we're going to talk about the Edmonton Oilers and about Ken Holland and Chiarelli and all the changes. But I thought that because of everything that's been happening in the news, I think we need to first start off with the mental health side and what's happening with the coaches. And I've been reading a lot on the Twitter with what Dan Carcillo is putting out, and I just wanted to read a tweet here that he had said. He wrote, to the victims who may be seeing comments like, put a name on it and remaining anonymous is BS. Don't feed into this narrative. If you'd like to tell me your story about hockey and abuse, you can make an impact in someone's life, whether you put a name on your experience or not. And then he also brought up in another tweet, which is on November 28th, he said, several young men from the Alberta area have reached out about a suitor brother. They wish to remain anonymous for fear of retribution from the hockey community and the old cowboy mentality that they're fighting against. More to come. And so we've got Bill Peters of the Flames is gone, and you got Babcock. Like, I don't know. What's your thoughts on what's going on here?
Well, obviously with the mental health problems and the concussions and stuff like that definitely. Well, the programs in place are definitely better now than they have been. There's concussion protocols and there's concussion spotters and stuff on the ice. But it had to get to the point where players and lawsuits were so bad that ownership was forced to do something. And they have. And it's definitely for the better. And I'm hoping that it prevents these tragedies that happen. But the reason why it doesn't get talked about too much is because it's not entertaining. And it shouldn't be entertaining. It's important information that we should know about, like the concussions and the mental health of hockey players and stuff like that. Like it's a crapshoot it's not often talked about. It's often overlooked because it's not entertaining. It's not junk food for the mind.
I was reading something today. There's some guys that are calling Carcillo out. He's just trying to stir things up, and he's trying to do everything he can to stay relevant in the media. Here you have a guy that's been, or for a while, been out there promoting, the mental health and what's happened. I was reading one guy saying, it's like the pot calling the kettle black. You were an enforcer. You're talking about you've got concussions and you've also the cause of a ton of concussions, right? So I don't know, like he's really having sort of kind of to walk this really fine line, for credibility. I think from a lot of people's standpoints, to believe, because I mean, there's sort of this unwritten code that whatever happens in the locker room, you keep your mouth shut and you're not going to be talking about that out in the general public, right? And so now you've got these coaches, careers are falling apart. I'm interested to see what your perspective is on Bill Peters of the Flames. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, definitely the Bill Peters situation is, and we'll get when we do an episode on the Flames there, we'll get more into it. But just because it's fresh in everybody's mind right now, the situation that happened there is that he was there was a tweet that came out about racial slurs that he used when he was the coach of the Ice Hogs for the I think it was the Chicago farm team. Anyway, when he was a farm team coach there, he made some racial slurs towards a kid, one of his prospects. It didn't come out until now, and it was 8 or 9 years ago that he said it. And the franchise has to take that very seriously. They can't, once stuff like that gets out in the open, it can tarnish the badge, tarnish the emblem on the jersey.
Right.
And you can't, if he's been accused of racial slurs, can't have him on that bench. You just can't, right? Like it's a reflection of your business and a reflection of your franchise. And good, bad, right or wrong, I think the Flames did the right thing by taking time to do an investigation, that they didn't just jump the gun and fire him, but they 90% fired him, right? They relieved him of his duties, but they did their research to their credit, right? And there's more little bits of information leaking out about abuse towards some of the kids. Carolina, when he was the coach in Carolina, he was a bit rough, I guess. And in this day and age, you can't get away with that. And I think this is a very strong message to young coaches coming up, that you're allowed to be hard and you're allowed to be insistent and pushy, but not bullied and not abusive, verbally, physically. There's a line there that what, as you said, what was sacred in the locker room is no longer okay. That things are being said that are not okay, and things are being done that are not okay. And coaches are in a position of power over their players, and they do have to enforce a system. I think coaches do have to be heavy-handed. You're dealing with a lot of hockey players. You're dealing with a lot of hockey egos, right? And coaches have to make sure everybody's on board and driving in the same direction, right? So you've seen lots of evidence over the years of Iron Mike Keenan and Daryl Sutter and coaches like that have a record of success, but they were hard to play for, right? But when you walk away from it, you recognize their success, and there's a respect that they have between four players that play under them, right? So they're hard, but they're not humiliating. They're not mean. They're not bullies. That kind of stuff, right? And what you're hearing from the Bill Peters situation is that he's not the kind of stand-up individual that you want leading your franchise, right? He's the one that he's on the bench. He's at every game. He's in front of cameras. He's in front of fans, and that's not the kind of hate that you want to display.
No kidding.
With Babcock, it's the same thing, is that you didn't know what was being done or what was being said behind closed doors. Not really, because hockey players are really close to the chest like that, right? And definitely as a rookie, there's obstacles you have to conquer, and it's hard. It's hard for every rookie, whether you're Sidney Crosby or anybody, right? The farm team prospect, right? It's going to be hard, and coaches got to push you hard to get better. But when you're like established players, and in the Toronto situation, it's the Mitch Marner thing people keep talking about, is that in his rookie season, Babcock was in front of the rest of the team, was that bully. He was that jerk. And for lots of people talking about the character of Babcock. And a business doesn't care about a person's character or their personality. They don't. they care about results and they care about numbers. So when you get from an ownership perspective and stuff like that, it's they don't care so much about what is being said or what is happening, as long as it doesn't tarnish their company and it doesn't tarnish their revenue. Unfortunately, Babcock was let go, and I definitely want to get into that too when we got a whole big Toronto segment too for all the Maple Leaf fans out there, and I think we'll dig more into the Mike Babcock thing there, because you get me rambling here, and I'll I'll be at it for another hour.
Well, I think it was Marner that I read who said that Babcock made him write a list, I think it was, of who was the guys with the greatest strength on the team and the guys that were the weakest. He took that list and then told everybody, and then told them that he was the one who wrote it. I mean, yeah, it's interesting I mean, you always know that you're going to have coaches that are going to be hard on their players.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it kind of, reminds me of the construction industry in a way, right? You have old school superintendents, they're not going to tolerate egos, and they're not going to tolerate, some guy who's going to go off on some tangent or whatever. Right. And that's changed. Right. I mean, that's hugely changed. They can't be doing that. I mean, you can't have guys throwing clipboards or cocking some guy against the head or something, because, you just can't do that. The construction industry had to, to some extent, it had to evolve and change. So it couldn't do that because with the times. But I think here you have this kind of code behind the scenes where you've got these young guys that are coming through juniors and stuff. And, when you're going through juniors and want to go into that, you want to become a pro, right? You're not going to want to become blacklisted in any way, right? So you're going to endure whatever it's going to take for you to break through and hopefully become pro.
Yeah.
And you keep your mouth shut, right? The unfortunate thing is that the level that these coaches have gone to has gone
too far,
right? And now you've got times have changed, and it's got like what happened in the States with Cosby and the Me Too movement, right? It's the same thing. Like things that are coming from 10, 20, 30 years ago, it's all coming forward. It's no different with Peters. It's the same thing. Like it was like from 10 years ago, right? So
yeah, as I said, this is a good message to young coaches coming up. I think they had to make a strong message. Like Babcock was the highest paying coach in the league. Everybody wanted a piece when
he was like doing what, $5 million a season, wasn't he? Or what?
8.
He was 8.
He's $8 million a season. Yeah. So he's the highest paid coach. He signed with Toronto because they offered him the big cha-ching. Buffalo tried really hard to sign him, but really he could have gone anywhere and coached. He had that kind of resume, a couple of gold medals at the Olympics and stuff like that. I don't know if it went to his head. I don't know if, it's tough to say.
So, I mean, the question now, so in your opinion, I mean, do you think Peter's career is pretty much cooked? And what about Babcock?
I think Babcock's is cooked too in the NHL. He's not a media darling anymore. These questions are going to follow him for years. And no team wants those kind of questions asked, right? They don't want that kind of publicity. They don't want that kind of attention. It's as I said with Peters, right? It tarnishes the crest on your jersey, right? And that's their business.
Yeah.
And they're not going to bring in somebody who's going to bring in the negative media attention, right? Like I think he's officially blacklisted himself. Peters as well. And it's unfortunate it had to go down this route, but it's also very relieving that people are standing up and speaking it.
Yeah.
Like there's a difference between a hard-nosed coach and a jerk. Hopefully the new coaches coming up see this, that you don't have to go to those depths to get that peak performance out of your players, right? Like there's other ways of doing it, to inspire them and to motivate them, right? Like you don't have to be that bully in the class that tries to make everybody around him better.
Well, and I think that's kind of why we're doing the format for the business of hockey and the goal. That's kind of why we're splitting this up into 2 different episode formats, right? We want to focus on sort of the hockey of management side with between the Hashmarks, and then the second format or episode style, the Syndicate. I really want to get more into, like, I've watched some videos that Dan Carcillo had put out, and he's I can appreciate you're angry.
Yeah.
I can understand that. I understand that he's angry and of what's happened to him, and he wants to, in his own way, fight back. I understand that.
Yeah.
But there was something that I saw on his Twitter page that really stood out. And he actually has a video, main ownership, different teams. He's singling them out, and Bettman, right? He's singling them all out and, in essence, calling them liars is what he's doing. I think there's a really fine line between, if you're going to promote mental health and you're going to promote supporting kids and you're going to promote, the guys that are in junior hockey, or if you're going to be that voice, I guess is what I'm trying to say. If you're going to be the voice for mental health, you have to keep a level of professionalism.
Yeah.
And I think he's in certain areas, he's crossing that line. He needs to be really, really careful with, because I think once you start attacking ownership, your credibility will start to be affected and people are going to question you. Now, for entertainment purposes, you know what? That's great. Yeah. Guys and fans and whoever, they'll be like cheering, yeah, go after these guys.
Yeah.
If you really want to create something that is an advocacy for junior hockey guys, or anyone even who's even pro, anyone who doesn't have a voice, I think you really need to be careful not to cross that line. And I think that in certain areas, I think he's crossing that line. The other episode format, which is the Syndicate, one of the reasons why I was pushing that so hard, operations and all of that, that's one end. But when you start getting into that ownership group side, I think that's a totally different animal. And that's one of the reasons why I pushed so hard for having that second episode format, because then we can split this and then get into that much more detailed. And I really want to get into, and we are going to get into the stuff that Dan is talking about, and the ownership groups try to bring some light to this, because I think that whatever you do and the way you explain it has to be balanced. And again, like I said, my concern that I have with what he's doing is, I understand, there's guys out there that are talking about, him being in the enforcer role and himself causing concussion on guys. And again, it's the pot calling the kettle black. But I think if he's going to be playing an advocate, I think he needs to not attack in that type of way. And I don't know what your thought is on that, but that's kind of where I stand on that.
Well, we'll definitely dig into it more. I will say that he's always been a passionate person. You could see that on how he played hockey, and he's definitely taking his passion to this. And you're right, he's probably crossing lines that he shouldn't cross. And he's very motivated and he's very passionate about his cause. As you said, we can talk about that more on the Syndicate.
Let's go back to the original topic here of what we wanted to talk about for the inaugural episode, the Edmonton Oilers.
Yep.
What? Wow. 13 years.
Once in 13 years.
Once in 13 years. We have hope. Let's go right back to the beginning. Why was Chiarelli hired, and what were the reasons behind that?
Okay, well, the foundation of the Chiarelli hiring was that Edmonton was in a tough division. They had, when I say tough, I mean physically tough. Like, you had teams like Anaheim, who was big and strong. You had teams like Los Angeles that was big and strong, and San Jose Sharks were big and strong. And and those were the teams that were being successful in the division, right? Is that they were plowing over people. The Edmonton Oilers had a cast of very, very skilled forwards. They had Sam Gagner. They had Justin Schultz on defense. They had Jordan Eberle. They had all of these skilled guys, which any team would want. These skilled guys. The problem is that all those guys are small. Like in stature, they're small players. They're great hockey players, but they're small. And Edmonton was being bullied around the ice, and they were being steamrolled. And there was lots of accusations of the Oilers being too soft. So when we talk about the culture of a franchise or the identity of a hockey team, that is one you don't want. You don't want to be known as soft. You don't want to be known as small. You don't want to be known as easy to push around. This is a tough game. Yeah, there's a lot of tough guys, and these guys are warriors out on the ice, right? And Edmonton had a lot of high draft picks, and they loved their skill guys, and they selected skill guy after skill guy. You had to when you're that high in the draft, right? Your options become really limited. Like there's only really one clear number one. There's only been a couple of drafts where you could have gone with somebody else. Anyway, the reason why Chiarelli was hired was because in Boston, completely different. The identity of Boston, even to this day, is that's a tough team. Right there, you had Zdeno Chara, you had Sean Thornton, you had Milan Lucic, you had these tough guys. So they were big, they were strong, they were tough, they ground you out. That was a tough team, and they won a cup doing that. So there was evidence of success with it, and Edmonton wanted to be tough. Now Peter Chiarelli was fired from the Boston Bruins, and the Edmonton Oilers took the opportunity to fire Craig McTavish, and on the exact same day hired Peter Chiarelli in 2015, April. The idea was that he was brought in to bring that similar identity that he had in Boston. That he was supposed to try and create a team that could compete with these big teams down in Southern California. That's a Boston team, right? The big problem was that Edmonton is not Boston, and things went wrong.
Yeah, so Chiarelli, there's no question he made a mess. What are your thoughts on the good and the bad things that he did for the franchise? When he was trying to create this identity of being strong.
Well, he, I think it's almost like he tried too fast. Like he tried to change it overnight. There was obviously he had McDavid. McDavid was drafted the year before. Who wouldn't want to try and general manage a team with McDavid on it? So because he was the next hot shot in the league. So Chiarelli was given the general manager position and the president of hockey operations. So he didn't have a boss except for ownership, right? There was no middleman. So he kind of had control over the whole thing. And he made some good moves and he made some bad moves. It didn't seem all that good at the time, but when he signed Leon Draisaitl to $8.5 million a season, at that time it seemed a little bit high. Right now it seems like a bargain. Like Edmonton fans are really happy that he's playing for an Oilers jersey, and he's playing really well this year. And so it's hard to argue that contract. He did sign McDavid for $12.5 million. That's a no-brainer. He had to. There was there was no way around it. You had to sign McDavid. That's your franchise man. A couple of the other moves he did were okay too. He signed Clefbaum, which once again at the time seemed like a high contract for just over $4 million. He didn't have a lot of NHL experience, but now he's the top guy in Edmonton. You think of the number one defenseman, it's Oscar Clefbaum, right? And that was a Chiarelli contract. So Chiarelli has done some good things, but certainly the bad things have outweighed what he has done good. And that is...
Well, I think the most glaring one that everybody knows is Lucic, right?
Well, for me, it's a toss-up between the Lucic or the Taylor Hall trade. Definitely, but they were both connected in the same route. Lucic was brought in to replace Taylor Hall, right? Peter Chiarelli did that because Lucic played for him in Boston, and Lucic was a good 60-point guy at the time. Maybe 30 goals if you could hit 30 goals, but he was tough, he was mean, he was big. He was the kind of guy you wouldn't want to mess with. Like he wasn't just an
Well,
enforcer.
wasn't Lucic was brought in as the enforcer to protect McDavid, wasn't it?
Yes, he was. He was the guy who could still score 30 goals at the time. He was brought in to play on McDavid's wing, and they thought it was a match made in heaven. Here's a guy who could stand in front of the net while McDavid's flying around the ice, and it turned into a disaster, as every Edmonton Oiler fan knows. Lucic performed well in his first season, not too bad, but the wheels certainly fell off after that. He lost his scoring touch, and he himself lost a grasp on his role on the team and his identity with the team, and it was unfortunate. To bring Lucic in, though, the salary cap was tight. Chiarelli had to shed some salary. If I was an Oiler fan, I'd be more upset at the Taylor Hall trade.
Absolutely.
You traded Taylor Hall, who was a winner. Like his whole attitude was, he came from the Windsor Spitfires in the OHL. That was a winning franchise. He won cup after cup there. He was a winner. That guy was a winner. You brought him in first overall pick, and he was a character guy. He loved to win. He hated losing, but he wanted to make that franchise successful. He took it very personally, and good for him. You should, as part of the leadership on a team, right? You've got to take some of the shoulder of that responsibility. And he did. He was a strong voice in the locker room. He wanted his team to win. And he had lots of seasons of not winning. He was very passionate about it. But when Chiarelli came in, this identity shift that he was trying to create in the team was to shift the leadership role to McDavid, the franchise guy. He's no doubt your franchise guy. McDavid, that's not debatable at all. Right. But every Oiler fan right now is probably screaming into the computer right now saying, can you imagine Taylor Hall on McDavid's wing?
Absolutely.
With Draisaitl. Right. That would be potent. His $6 million cap hit was exactly the same as Lucic's.
It became known that there was a very much of the morale dropped in the locker room, sort of this mentality where it was sort of all the losing culture of the locker room, the denial of it. But I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, nobody likes to admit it. No player likes to admit it. But when there's a history of losing, eats at your brain slowly and slowly. And as things got worse and worse, Taylor Hall got louder and louder, which you should, if you're trying to correct the situation. And he was a strong voice in the locker room because of this losing culture that was there. And not that he was creating it, he was trying to fight it, right? He was a winner. He wasn't used to losing. Part of what I read a story somewhere that Chiarelli wanted McDavid to be the voice in the locker room. He wanted him to be the leader, the franchise guy. Everything after that was to be about McDavid and the new guys. Is that Chiarelli was brought in to try and change that identity and change that culture. And he thought by silencing the loudest man in the room would give McDavid the loudest voice.
But didn't Andrew Ferretz, I thought he did a episode, I think it was on 31 Thoughts, and I think that's where it was, and he had made a comment about that Hall was nothing more than a partier.
Well, he was a kid, and I'm not going to make judgments on kids. You see guys like Tyler Seguin and Brad Marchand, like if they were partiers, they're still great hockey players. Taylor Hall, I think, even if he was a partier, he just became a millionaire. I can't speak for him.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Personally, and certainly Andrew Ferentz was a veteran guy, and he'd been around the league a bit. So when he came to the Oilers, he already is seasoned, right? And he wasn't doing that kind of stuff. And Taylor Hall was a kid, and there was a lot of hype around him. And McDavid is certainly carrying himself in a splendid kind of way. I think he's a great captain, and I think he's a great leader of that franchise. And I think it was a bit much to ask him as a 19-year-old, to be the voice in the locker room.
I would think it'd be pretty overwhelming for the guy, right?
Yeah, he handled it as best as he could, calm and collected, right? Anyway, the trading of Taylor Hall was a big blow to Chiarelli because of what he brought back. Now, Adam Larsson is not a bad defenseman. He's a one-dimensional defenseman. He's a defensive defenseman. I think when they traded for Adam Larsson, they were hoping that he would bloom into his potential. Like he was still young enough that there was still room to grow. That sometimes defensemen take longer to bloom, to mature into the game. He is a good hockey player, but it seemed like a very out of balance trade. That Taylor Hall was an already established scorer, fast guy on the ice, and he was a performer, and he was a good performer. And Adam Larsson, a lot of the fan base and a lot of the media were confused by that trade, that they didn't get more for Taylor Hall. So it's not so much that they did trade for Taylor Hall; it's what they got. Like they didn't get much back. Like they didn't get a draft pick or nothing. It was a 1-for-1 trade. Taylor Hall for Adam Larsson. And as I said, Adam Larsson is a good defenseman. He's a good stay-at-home defenseman. He's very responsible like that, and he's a big guy too. He's a bigger defenseman. Chiarelli felt that Taylor Hall needed to go in his mind. When Chiarelli was in Boston, he did the same thing to Tyler Seguin, who was actually drafted right after Taylor Hall. Tyler Seguin was a partier as well, and Peter Chiarelli traded him, and it was a very weird situation there. But getting off topic, back to the Taylor Hall thing, is that Taylor Hall left, and he left a little bitter. He didn't want to go, because he felt he wasn't done in Edmonton, right? And I think that's what stings Edmonton Oilers fans the most, is that he didn't ask to leave, he didn't want to be traded, and he was actually a little upset that he was traded, because he wanted to be part of the solution instead of part of the problem. And Chiarelli made him part of the problem in this trade. It kind of soured fans. So now everybody was a little sketchy about.
Everybody was bitter with Chiarelli, and so I think it sort of got to the point where ownership finally made the decision that it was time for him to move on.
Yeah,
I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
He was fired January 22nd, 2019. So he had a long tenure. He had a good coach. Everybody was after his coach. It was Todd McClellan, and things didn't work out well for the coach. Chiarelli was kind of reeling a little bit, and he seemed like a lot of his trades and everything were peer pressure based and performance based. Like he was.
Well, I think one of the problems with Chiarelli was the fact that he was a shitty communicator, right? I mean, he kept everything close to his chest, right? I mean, from what I understand, he didn't even communicate really within the organization. Nobody really knew what his moves were going to be, right? He kept everything pretty low key. And I think that was probably one of the main problems, was his communication skills.
Yeah.
What the hell is going on?
Yeah.
Because he wasn't explaining anything to anybody. But it wasn't just that the fans didn't know what was going on, that nobody in the organization knew what was going on.
Yeah.
And then what nobody knew, what wasn't clear until Holland was brought in, was what was happening with Cates, right? So here you got a guy who's sick from 2017. He's got a life-threatening disease, and he's going through multiple surgeries, and he basically hands the keys over to the Ferrari and says, go at it, do whatever you need to do to get this thing back on track, right? Yeah. But because Chiarelli didn't put or look at developing those systems that were necessary to be successful and to be able to make strategic decisions that would be for the betterment of the club, not just today, but long-term as well.
Yeah.
This was the end result. And you had this uprising. I mean, a lot of people were assuming you're going to have people showing up downtown Edmonton, basically with flamethrowers and pitchforks, trying to get rid of this guy. But I think that one of the main reasons why Chiarelli was finally tossed, it was an economic thing, right? You had player boxes that were coming up for renewal. You had seats were up for renewal. You had all these different things that were coming up for renewal. And everybody was basically putting their finger up and saying, screw this. I mean, we've supported you guys for 13 years.
Yeah.
What have you guys done? And you guys are just basically raking in our cash, but you're not stepping up or doing anything for us as a team to even make an effort. So you have fan after fan finally saying, you know what, we're done. And the thing was is that Cates is still on the hook. Not only the city of Edmonton, but Cates is on the hook for paying for that arena.
Yeah.
So if he has no revenues coming in, I mean, they had to do something strictly from an optics standpoint. Chiarelli had to get out of there.
Yeah. No, definitely. He was unpopular with the fans. And this is certainly a performance-based industry, right? You have to perform and it has to be good performance. And Chiarelli had, like, we could make a long list of all the bad moves he made because there was a lot. And we only brought up 2, but those were the 2 heaviest hitters. And they really soured the fan base. And in Canada, you can't do that. You know, we're the lifeblood of those franchises. And, you know, Edmonton isn't a big franchise, but it's a passionate one.
Right.
And the fans are definitely passionate, and they were not Chiarelli fans at all. And the team that he put together was a disaster. Like, how can you imagine a team with Leon Draisaitl, Connor McDavid, a disaster? Like, now, like, if you think about it, like, how could you make that team a disaster? You have, you know, 2 big franchise guys like that.
Yeah.
And somehow you were still putting out a poor product. And, you know, that's the losing culture in the locker room. And, you know, like McDavid was expressing it too in his exit interviews at the end of last season, is that losing culture. It's not like they're choosing to lose. Of course not. You know, they're all winners. They're all competitors. You know, you'd be hard pressed to find more competitive people than hockey players.
Absolutely.
Right? Incredibly competitive people. So the losing culture really hurts.
Yeah.
You know, they don't want it.
Well, and I think that once the decision was made and Chiarelli was tossed, they put Keith Gretzky in as interim.
Yeah.
They brought in Hitchcock. That was pretty tough. I still give credit to Hitch for putting Leon on the straight and narrow, because I know that there was one thing that had happened where he showed a video in the locker room of him basically lollygagging off the ice. I've said this on, you know, Hitch was instrumental in getting Leon back on, getting him on track to become what he is today. And there was a big uproar about Keith Gretzky being interim GM, becoming into the GM, because we're not going to get into this, the whole thing of the old boys network, but it wasn't conducive, like you said, to the product moving forward, what to basically do. And so everybody was sitting in this holding position waiting to find out who's going to actually step up and is actually going to take this role.
Yeah.
And we had basically Ken Holland come to the rescue. I think that without a doubt, the credibility and respect that man created with the Edmonton fan base was getting rid of Lucic and sending him to Calgary. Hands down, that was set up a level of credibility and respect from the fan base, because from their standpoint, you have this albatross contract that's basically sitting there and they can't move it. And everyone's basically going, we're screwed because we're paying this guy. There's no point of playing the guy. Just bench him.
Yeah.
There's no need for him, right? Yeah. And I know that I made a joke when he got one of his bonuses. He got a $3 million bonus, his last one before he got traded. And I made a joke about how he went to Vancouver and bought himself a new Ferrari with a custom license plate that said "suckers." Right? I mean, it was a joke.
Yeah.
And so it's people like Lucic and what he does that gives a bad rap to the guys that are trying really hard.
Yeah.
Because he gives sort of the optics. I'm just there to collect a paycheck.
Yeah.
Right. And I think at the very tail end last season when Hitchcock was there, I remember he had an interview press conference with the media, and he made a comment about how the coaches can't want it more than the players. Right. And I mean, he backtracked off that afterwards. I mean, there's no question management talked to him about that. That was inappropriate from their standpoint. But I think that kind of captures what was going on, right? And I think you have this kind of everything was broken.
Yeah.
Right? You have these guys that they're not putting in the effort. They're going through the motions to try to finish it because they're contractually obligated to finish what they need to finish. They want to finish this season. You've got a frustrated coach that's trying everything he can, but his hands are tied because of what Chiarelli did and the assets that he provided to him, right? And now he can only do so much with that, right? So I think when Holland came in, he's an interesting guy because he's very straight shooting. He doesn't beat around the bush. I'm not going to get into the whole Puljujarvi thing with the agent trying to push Puljujarvi, trade him or something. But if you're an Edmonton Oilers fan, it's like you've had these guys running the franchise just like a bunch of kids. You know what I mean? Like, just it's been so disconnected, and all of a sudden you've got this guy coming in from Detroit who's like, he's ultra professional.
Yeah.
And it's like the adults have arrived and the fans are like, we don't know what's going on because we're not used to this. We don't know what this is.
Well, and one of the first things he did do was trade Lucic. And I think the big staple for that one is not only the performance of James Neal, who's played really well this year, but it was one of the sticking points with Chiarelli is that he left with this contract, the Lucic contract. And I think it was a very good message to the fan base when Holland came in and he dealt with the biggest mistake left on the roster in some fans' minds. And he did. And I think that was a very, very good message to the fan base that he's here for real.
Yeah.
He means business.
Yeah.
And you're right. He brought a sense of calm. Like, he just calmed everybody down. He wasn't going to be pushed into making decisions, and he wasn't going to be forced into bad decisions.
Yeah.
Now I am going to go the Jesse Puljujarvi route, since you wouldn't. But I will, because I think it's a good example of what I mean by he's not going to be pushed into making a decision. There was lots of question marks with Puljujarvi and his development and his role on the team. Right, he lost confidence in the franchise. Puljujarvi did, because of the way he was deployed and the way he was treated. And unfortunately, that was all Chiarelli. And he's been tarnished by Chiarelli. And they brought in a new coach, Dave Tippett, and they brought in a new general manager. And I believe he's the president of hockey operations as well, Ken Holland. They gave him a new voice and a new leadership to talk to. Unfortunately, that didn't change his opinion. He's over in Finland now, which is great. But I think what you take away from this is that Ken Holland wasn't going to be pushed into making a trade for this asset or with this asset. Is that there was another problem that needed to be dealt with, and he wasn't going to be forced into making a split decision, a quick decision. He's made the right call to let Puljujarvi play in Finland there and potentially gain some value. You know, there's a good chance he'll never play for the Oilers again, but that doesn't mean he had to trade him shotgun, cast him away, right? He's still an asset to the franchise. So he wants to see if that asset will grow.
So in your opinion, what are the approach differences between Holland and Chiarelli? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's definitely a sense of professionalism. There's a difference between Ken Holland was the general manager of Detroit Red Wings for 22 years, and I think they made the playoffs for 20 of those, maybe 21 of those years, like a lot. So he was he was the general manager for a few cups. You know, they won probably 3 or 4 with him as the general manager, and he held a certain respect with the players. Right, he knew how to communicate with them. Like, that's probably the biggest thing, is that he knew how to communicate with ownership, with management, with coaches, with players. He was there so long, it was his family, right? Everybody knew where his office was, right? Like, that's his role. So that comfort of where he was at, like, I think Chiarelli was only general manager for 4 or 5 years in Boston. He didn't come in with that sense of calm approach. He didn't settle everybody down. he thought the solution to settle everybody down was to change everything, right? To change the team identity and stuff. Despite the fact that the team was built around skill and speed, he like it was a complete 180 that he tried to do. He tried to make them big and tough, and you just can't do that, right? Like you lost the entire confidence of the fan base in Chiarelli. And when Ken Holland came in, it wasn't a teardown with him. You know, he didn't come in to change the identity. He didn't come in to tear the team back down to the bare bones and try again. He didn't come here to make a mess. He came here to bring stability and calm professionalism. And he did. And his message to the fans was trading the biggest sore they had. You know, and I don't want to bash on Milan Lucic too much. You know, like he was brought in to do a role and he didn't fit. You know, he's playing his best in Calgary now, but as a person, you know, he knew what he was getting into and he knew the role that he wanted to do. And you know what? Based on his previous performances, he was worth that contract at the time. And he had one good season, and then it kind of the wheels fell off. And you know, he hasn't been able to rebound since then, and he may never. But at the time, he was worth about that. It was just a big contract. That's what everybody was scared about, was that it was a 7-year commitment for. There was a lot of knots in the contract.
Well, and I think that's something that we're going to get into in the other series, the Syndicate. From the business standpoint, a lot of people made a big deal about the no movement clause. I made it really clear for a long time that the non-movement clause can be broken. And I would get into arguments with people that there is no way that you can break a no movement clause once it's in that contractual agreement. And I argued you can. And, you know, and I said that the only way that you can break that no movement clause, and this was about probably 4 months before he got traded and before Holland came in, was that the person who requested the non-movement clause, he's the one who can break it. And that's what I said, right? It didn't matter. Like, so from an optics standpoint, there's this belief that whatever is put into the contract, that's it.
Yeah.
But that's not true.
No.
Right. And so in the end, that's what I think really opened up the eyes with a lot of fans and a lot of people. Like, how was this even possible?
Yeah.
Right. It was possible because he agreed to it. Right. He didn't want to be a part of that anymore. He didn't want to be involved in that organization anymore. He had no interest in that anymore because he was basically being shit on, in essence. Right. He was be treated as a nobody.
Yeah, well, it was definitely mismanaged. That's why we made this episode about Peter Chiarelli. Is that he was brought in to be a savior, and he turned out to be the exact opposite.
Yeah,
and he set the franchise back a few more years. Yeah, like it was mismanaged, and that's why certain players don't want to play there anymore. And I think Ken Holland brings in that experience. They had to bring in somebody experienced. You can't just start fresh with a new guy. And they found the perfect guy in Ken Holland. I think his the terms of his departure from Detroit we'll probably save for another episode.
Absolutely.
I think Detroit has such a rich history in ownership and in management that we could probably talk all day about the class of that franchise. Yeah,
and that's something that in the Syndicate we're going to talk about, because I've also argued this for a really long time. If you look at someone like Cates, sure, you're dealing with a guy, he's got billions of dollars in assets and things like that.
Yeah.
But you look at what Holland really truly represents. From the outside, people look at Holland and they're like, he's coming in to be a GM. I've argued from the very beginning that it's like he's on loan from the Illich family. And the reason I keep saying that is because
whoa. Let's save that. You gotta save some juicy stuff for the Syndicate.
Fair enough. Fair enough. But anyways, it's about that. There are a multitude of other reasons on why he is involved with Edmonton, and it goes beyond just being the GM, right?
Yeah.
And so with Holland being in place now, how, in your opinion, he making a difference? Like what is he doing that's different?
Well, as I said, he's brought in that calm maturity, that professionalism, and that's a big one. He sent a message to fans with the Lucic trade, and I think he sent a message to probably the coaches, I would say, with the Puljärvi going to Finland, and that he's not just going to bandage a team together. And bringing in Dave Tippett, who had a lot of experience down in Arizona, was probably his best move. Is that he brought in a veteran coach who could play around the players that he had. In Arizona, they had all kinds of cap issues, financing issues, and stuff, right? So there was a lot of teams there that there was a budget team, as we call it, and Dave Tippett did wonders on a budget team. So you give him a team that's not a budget team. He's showing his true colors now. And even Ken Holland gives tons and tons of praise to the coach. It was Ken Holland who brought him in, brought Dave Tippett in. Dave Tippett had other options. He could have waited for that Seattle job. There's a few coaching positions available now, right? With Calgary, and I think Toronto's buttoned up with their coach now. But he had options, and he waited, and he was contacted, and he took the job. Who wouldn't want to coach Connor McDavid?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you know what? He's come in, and the team has bought in. They don't feel mismanaged anymore. They don't feel that something could happen at a moment's notice. That Ken Holland's going to pull the trigger on a quick decision. Like Chiarelli, you had no idea what was coming. As you said, he didn't talk to anybody. He didn't tell anybody. He didn't use the assets around him, his management team around him. And I think Ken Holland does. And so that's, for me, that's the biggest difference is that the sense of professionalism in that management now is much different. It feels like there's somebody actually driving the ship.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely, it does exactly what it feels like.
And as we want to talk about more in this series, that's why it starts from the top and works its way down. If you look at the Oilers roster, it's not that much different from last season. Lucic is out and Neal is in, but beyond that, it's fairly similar. It's basically similar. So why are you getting two different results? You got two different coaches, yes, but why? Right. The personnel is basically the same. So it's decisions from, it's amazing the culture comes right from the top.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to talk about in the Syndicate, because it's interesting you should bring that up, because I definitely want to talk about that from the organizational standpoint. And I've read a couple of things lately that actually just triggered in my mind. Definitely want to touch upon that in there. So, well, you know what? This has been great. I hope you guys enjoy this first inaugural episode series formats between the Hashmarks and the Syndicate. They make up the business of hockey and the goal. And so we're going to finish this podcast episode up, and then we are going to look at producing the second one. And we're going to get into when I was so politely told to not talk. We'll go back to what I was talking about with Holland in the Syndicate and really get into a lot more of the nuts and bolts of the business side.
Yeah.
So if there's anything else you have to say.
Well, I think Oiler fans are excited this season. Their team is playing up to standards. I still feel that there's some holes on defense, but you can tell they're happier.
Absolutely.
The team's happier, the fans are happier, and I'm really happy for them. But I think, do you want to give them a tidbit for the next episode of Between the Hashmarks? Okay. Well, because of there's definitely two teams that we can go to now with the news of Babcock and Bill Peters that we discussed earlier. I think we're going to go in the direction of the Toronto Maple Leafs, though. That there's a lot of management decisions that have happened there. They got the new GM, Kyle Dubas, and he was handed a tall order in his position. And we'll see the pros and the cons, and how he's put his team together. I think it'll be fun and exciting, and I know there's a lot of Leaf fans out there, so I'm sure they're anxious to hear.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. we'll be doing the Syndicate and posting it here shortly.
See you guys later.
Thanks for listening to Between the Hashmarks from the Business of Hockey and the Goal.